The studio lights shone brightly over the polished stage, and the audience sat buzzing with excitement waiting for the next segment of the popular talk show to begin. The host, known for his sharp tongue and sarcastic humor, smiled at the cameras as he scanned the crowd for his next moment of entertainment. His eyes landed on a woman seated quietly in the front row, dressed in a plain dress with her hair pulled back. Simply, she did not stand out among the glitz and glamour of the audience. With a smirk, he pointed toward her and called her up to the stage, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come on up here, let's have some fun," he said, the crowd laughing along with him. The woman named Sarah stood slowly, clutching her small purse, her steps hesitant as she made her way to the stage. The host leaned into his microphone and teased her, asking if she could sing even half a note without scaring away the audience. The crowd erupted in laughter, some even clapping at the joke, while Sarah simply stood silently, her calm eyes fixed on the host. She gave a small nod, her voice soft but steady as she said, "I can sing." The host raised an eyebrow, playing it up for the cameras. "Oh, this is going to be good," he chuckled. A stagehand quickly handed her a microphone, and the lights dimmed slightly as the music director asked what she wanted to sing. Sarah whispered something into the microphone so quietly that only the music team heard it. The band began to play a gentle melody, soft and slow, filling the room with anticipation. The host leaned back in his chair with a grin, ready to watch her embarrass herself in front of the live audience. But as soon as Sarah opened her mouth, the atmosphere in the studio shifted completely. Her voice rose clear and powerful, carrying emotion that cut through the laughter and reached deep into every listener. The audience fell silent, jaws dropping as the notes filled the air. It was not just singing, it was storytelling woven into melody, her tone carrying sorrow, hope, and strength all at once. Even the host, who had set her up for mockery, leaned forward in shock, his smirk fading, replaced by wide eyes of disbelief. Each note grew stronger, flowing effortlessly as though the song had always lived within her, waiting for this very moment to be released. The room seemed to disappear, leaving only her voice echoing like a force of nature, unstoppable and raw. The cameras caught the audience members with tears in their eyes, some holding their breath as though afraid to break the spell. Sarah kept singing, her face serene, her hands gripping the microphone, not for fear, but for focus. The host shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable as he realized the joke had turned on him and the world was watching his reaction. But Sarah did not look at him. She kept her eyes closed, pouring herself into the music as though she was singing to something greater than the people around her. The final note she held hung in the air long after the band fell silent, vibrating in the hearts of every person in the room. The crowd erupted not in laughter, but in thunderous applause that shook the studio walls. Sarah lowered the microphone, her expression calm, but her eyes glistening with quiet pride as she stood in the center of the stage, bathed in the roar of the audience. The host tried to regain control of the moment, fumbling for words, but it was clear the spotlight had shifted. And Sarah, who walked onto the stage as a simple woman, now stood as something far greater in the eyes of everyone watching. Would you like me to continue building Sarah's journey after this moment, like what happens once the show ends, and how her life changes from that performance? The applause did not stop. It kept rolling through the studio like a wave as Sarah stood in the glow of the lights, her chest rising and falling with quiet control. People in the crowd were standing now, clapping, cheering, even whistling, some with tears streaking their faces, as if they had just witnessed something divine. The cameras zoomed in on Sarah, her simple dress, her unassuming appearance, now seeming to shine with an aura that no designer gown could ever match. The host sat frozen, his usual quick wit stolen by the power of what he had just heard. His cue card slipped from his hand onto the floor unnoticed. Sarah finally lowered her eyes and gave a small bow, her voice calm, as she thanked the band for playing with her. The band members themselves were in awe, some shaking their heads in disbelief, one of them mouthing the word "incredible" under his breath. The director in the control booth was barking orders into the headset, telling the crew to keep the cameras on her to capture every second of this moment. Sarah handed the microphone back gently, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from the release of so much emotion she had held inside for so long. The audience would not let her leave. They chanted her name, urging her to sing again, to give them just one more glimpse of that magic. The host finally stood, his voice unsteady as he tried to cover his own shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, the unbelievable Sarah," he said, forcing a smile though his eyes betrayed his regret. Sarah glanced at him only briefly, her gaze calm, as if she had nothing left to prove. She turned back toward the audience and gave them a nod of gratitude. The chanting grew louder, the people unwilling to let her fade back into the crowd. They wanted more, they wanted her story, they wanted to know who she was. Sarah stepped closer to the microphone again, the stagehand rushing it back into her hand as though it belonged there. Her lips parted and the studio fell into silence again, waiting with breathless anticipation for what would come next. And when she sang again, the room once more dissolved into a world shaped only by her voice and the truth it carried. Do you want me to carry Sarah's story beyond the studio to show how this one performance changes the course of her life and the lives of those who mocked her? The second song flowed from Sarah like a river, untouched by time, her voice filling every corner of the studio, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. This time the melody was softer, more intimate, a hymn of love and loss that seemed to speak directly into the hearts of everyone who heard it. People in the audience wiped their eyes, some clutching the hands of the person beside them as if afraid to let go in fear the moment might vanish. The cameramen themselves forgot to move their lenses for a moment, mesmerized until the director's voice snapped them back into their duty. The host remained seated, his hands clasped together in front of his mouth, staring as though he had never heard music until this very instant. Sarah closed her eyes as she sang, each note carrying pieces of her own story of nights spent alone with nothing but her dreams of a childhood when the world never listened to her voice, of the hope she had held onto despite it all. When the final note faded, it lingered in the silence like a prayer, unanswered, yet still alive, and then the crowd erupted again, louder than before. The studio lights seemed brighter, the stage bigger, yet Sarah remained the same, standing humbly, with her simple posture, her hands folded in front of her. The host rose slowly, his voice low and raw. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed will not be forgotten," he said, turning to Sarah, his face filled with something between awe and shame. Sarah gave him a small nod, her smile gentle as though forgiving him without a word, and that silence spoke louder than any insult he had once thought to make. Backstage, producers rushed to line up offers, record labels, agents, managers, all clamoring to reach her, but Sarah stepped past them as if none of it mattered right now. The only thing she carried with her was the peace of knowing she had finally shared her gift the way it was meant to be heard. But the world had already decided that she would not walk away unnoticed. This time her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Would you like me to continue showing how Sarah's voice spreads beyond the studio, touching lives far outside that single moment? As Sarah stepped out of the studio, the night air wrapped around her, cool and crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond. She took a deep breath, her chest rising as though she had shed years of silence in a single evening. Behind her, the audience was still buzzing, many staying in the lobby to talk about her as if they had just witnessed history unfold. The host, who had once mocked her, stood at the door watching her leave, his expression unreadable but his eyes softer than before, as though something inside him had been broken and rebuilt. Sarah walked down the street, her shoes tapping lightly against the pavement, each step echoing with a new kind of freedom. Her phone buzzed endlessly in her pocket, but she ignored it. She was not ready to drown her moment in noise. Instead, she let her memory replay the faces of the crowd, the tears, the stunned silence, the way her voice had reached people she had never known. For the first time, she realized her gift was not just hers to keep, it belonged to everyone who needed hope, everyone who longed for beauty in a world often too loud and unkind. At the corner of the street, a young girl ran up to her, clutching a small notebook, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Excuse me, are you Sarah?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. "I want to sing too, but everyone laughs at me. Can you teach me?" Sarah looked down at her, the memory of her own childhood rushing back like a tide pulling at her heart. She knelt down, smiling softly. "Of course," she said, and in that moment Sarah knew her journey was only beginning. Because her voice was no longer just about her, it was about the voices waiting to be heard, hidden in silence, waiting for courage. And the world had just opened its ears to her story, one that was far from over. Do you want me to continue by showing how Sarah's rise begins to inspire more people and how she navigates the sudden fame while staying true to her humble self? Sarah walked with a little girl by her side, the streetlights casting long shadows that stretched across the quiet road. The girl introduced herself as Emma, her eyes wide with admiration as she clutched the notebook like it was a treasure chest. Sarah asked her what kind of songs she liked, and Emma shyly hummed a tune of fragile melody that carried more heart than perfection. It reminded Sarah of her younger self when she used to sing in the small fields outside her home with no one listening but the wind. Sarah smiled and told Emma never to stop singing even when others laughed, because laughter fades but a true voice stays forever. As they parted ways, Sarah felt a warmth in her chest stronger than any applause she had received inside the studio. When she finally checked her phone, she saw hundreds of messages, producers, journalists, and strangers reaching out offering interviews, contracts, and praise. But Sarah ignored them all for the moment. She wanted silence. She wanted space to hold onto what had just happened before the noise of fame swallowed her whole. She returned home to her small apartment, the same place that had once felt too quiet, too small, and too ordinary. Now it felt different. It felt like the beginning of something bigger, something she had never dared to imagine. She stood by the window staring out at the city lights, her reflection faint against the glass, her violin resting on the chair behind her like a faithful companion waiting patiently. Her voice had opened a door, but she knew stepping through it would change everything. And deep down she wondered if she was ready to walk into a world that had finally decided to listen. Would you like me to continue by showing how Sarah faces the overwhelming flood of attention and how she balances staying true to her humble self with the sudden pressure of fame? Sarah lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, her mind restless with the echoes of the audience applause and the sight of Emma holding that notebook. Sleep would not come, so she rose quietly and walked to the window, the city alive with tiny dots of light stretching as far as her eyes could see. Her phone buzzed on the table again, relentless messages and calls, but Sarah let it be. She was not ready to answer the world, not yet. Instead, she picked up her violin, the familiar weight grounding her as she drew the bow across the strings slowly, letting the sound fill the room. The melody was soft, fragile like a whisper, but it carried a strength that steadied her heart. As the notes danced, she thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made, so she could chase a dream even when the world told her she was foolish. Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept playing, pouring every ounce of memory and emotion into the sound. Outside, a neighbor paused by the stairwell, listening quietly to the music that floated through the night air. Sarah did not know she had drawn an audience once again, this time not in a studio, not in a theater, but in the simple corners of her life. The applause from strangers meant something, but the quiet appreciation from those around her meant even more. She lowered her bow and let the silence settle, her chest rising and falling slowly as the weight of the evening pressed down on her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The spark had been lit, and the world would not stop searching for her voice now. But Sarah was determined that when they found her, they would not find just a performer. They would find a woman who had lived every note she played and every word she sang. Do you want me to show how Sarah first steps into this sudden fame, when producers and powerful voices in the industry begin chasing her down for opportunities? The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone buzzing, non-stop messages pouring in from people she did not even know. She rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion from the night still heavy in her bones, but when she unlocked the screen, she froze. Every platform was flooded with her performance clips, shared millions of times. The simple woman everyone had underestimated now being called a rising star. Her inbox was filled with invitations, talk shows, music producers, even reporters who wanted to know her story. Sarah sat at the edge of her bed, gripping the phone, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She had never asked for fame, yet here it was knocking at her door louder than ever. Her neighbor, Mrs. Collins, knocked softly on the door, holding a small basket of bread she had baked, and smiled warmly. "I saw you last night, Sarah," she said. "Your voice is a gift the world needs to hear." The sincerity in her words made Sarah's chest tighten. She thanked her quietly and placed the bread on the table, but her thoughts were racing. Later that day, Emma showed up again, her eyes wide with excitement. She waved her notebook like it was a treasure map. "Sarah, the offers are real," she said. "One producer wants to meet you in New York, another wants you to record a single immediately." Sarah blinked at her friend, overwhelmed by how quickly life had shifted from silence to chaos. She took a deep breath and whispered, "I only wanted to sing, not to be swallowed by this storm." Emma placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice steady. "Maybe this storm is where you finally learn how strong your roots are." Sarah looked out the window at the crowded street below, the noise of the city rising like a wave that is ready to crash over her. She tightened her grip on the violin case beside her. She would not let the noise drown her music, no matter how loud the world became. Do you want me to continue by showing how Sarah faces the overwhelming attention in her first big meeting with a powerful producer who doubts her simplicity? The day of the meeting came faster than Sarah expected. She found herself sitting in a tall glass building surrounded by people in suits rushing through the halls. Emma sat beside her, giving a reassuring nod, but Sarah could feel her heart pounding as the door to the studio opened. Inside the room, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a polished smile introduced himself as Mr. Dalton, a well-known producer who had shaped countless stars. He studied Sarah for a long moment before leaning back in his chair, his tone calm but distant. "So you are the simple woman who made the internet lose its mind?" Sarah gripped her violin case, her fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, sir, but I am just someone who loves music, nothing more." Mr. Dalton smirked, setting down a folder filled with contracts. "Talent is only part of the game," he said. "We can make you bigger than you ever dreamed, but you must learn to play by our rules." Emma leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What kind of rules?" Mr. Dalton shrugged. "Image control, rehearsed interviews, a change in style, maybe even a new name. We will turn Sarah into a star whether she is ready or not." Sarah felt the words strike her like cold water. She had never wanted to be turned into something she was not. Her music came from her heart, not from a script. She glanced at Emma, who gave her a look of quiet strength, and then back at the producer. With a steady voice, Sarah said, "I will play, but only as myself. If that is not enough, then I will walk out of this building right now." For the first time, Mr. Dalton's expression shifted. He leaned forward, studying her as though testing her resolve. The room grew silent, and the hum of the city outside seemed to fade away. Sarah kept her eyes locked on his, waiting to see if the man who claimed to shape stars would try to bend her, or finally listen to her music instead. Would you like me to continue with how Sarah proves her worth in that moment by playing her violin in front of Mr. Dalton and his team? Mr. Dalton tapped his fingers on the table, his gaze sharp as if he were weighing her words against the years of artists he had seen rise and fall. "Fine," he said. "Show me, then show me why you think you can walk into my office and defy the system everyone else bends to." Sarah opened her violin case slowly, her hands brushing over the polished wood of the instrument as though drawing strength from it. Emma squeezed her shoulder, whispering softly, "You have nothing to prove, just play the way you always do." Taking a deep breath, Sarah stood in the center of the room where the light from the tall windows poured over her. She lifted the violin and closed her eyes, blocking out the tension in the air. The bow touched the strings, and the first note rang out clear and pure. It cut through the silence, filling the room with a sound that seemed too powerful for such a simple space. Mr. Dalton leaned back in his chair, his confident smirk faltering slightly as the melody grew. Sarah poured her heart into every note, her fingers dancing across the strings with a grace born of years of quiet practice, not formal training. The music rose and swelled, telling stories words could never capture. It spoke of her struggles, her dreams, and the fire that burned in her spirit. It wrapped around everyone in the room, drawing them into her world. Even the assistants who had been typing on laptops froze one by one, their eyes lifting from their screens, their mouths parting in disbelief. Emma watched with tears welling in her eyes, proud and unshaken because she knew this was exactly who Sarah was meant to be. When the final note hung in the air and slowly faded into silence, no one moved. The room felt charged, as if every person present had been part of something unforgettable. Mr. Dalton slowly stood, his hands pressed against the desk, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression that was no longer arrogant, but humbled. "You are not what I expected," he said, his voice quieter now, but there was no denying the respect in his tone. Sarah lowered her violin, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She simply replied, "I told you, I will only play as myself." Emma smiled proudly as the weight of the moment settled around them, waiting to see what Mr. Dalton would say next. Do you want me to continue with how Mr. Dalton responds and whether Sarah's life begins to change after this performance? Mr. Dalton walked slowly around the table, his footsteps echoing in the silent room, his gaze never leaving Sarah. He stopped in front of her, and for the first time there was no arrogance in his eyes, only sincerity. "You were right," he said softly. "The system does not deserve to change you, it should be changed by you." Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Emma covered her mouth in shock. Mr. Dalton extended his hand, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet awe. "I would be honored to represent you to the world exactly as you are." Sarah glanced at Emma, who nodded with tears streaming down her face. Then she placed her hand in his, her heart racing. That single handshake sealed her path. Her music would no longer be confined to quiet rooms or forgotten corners. It would rise and reach the people who needed it most. Months later, the world knew her name. The simple woman who had once been mocked now stood on the grandest stages, her violin echoing in concert halls, her music touching hearts across the globe. And every time she played, Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the day they laughed at her only to be silenced forever by the truth of her song. The simple woman with her violin had become unforgettable. The end.